Okay, so next up, we will be hearing a little bit more about current and emerging ethical challenges in AI from Stuart Russell.
Thanks. Okay, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to try to move through this as quickly as I can to get to questions, which I think is the most important part. So first of all, let's get everyone on the same page. AI is about making intelligent machines. And what does that mean? Well, for most of the history of the field, it's meant machines whose actions can be expected to achieve their objectives, that they behave rationally, they do the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. And our goal, as stated pretty early on and has been consistent throughout, is that we want to make systems that are general purpose, that for any task that we care to have them do, they can quickly learn how to do it and maybe do it better than human beings. And this will have enormous impacts. A question we don't ask very often is, well, what if we actually succeed in doing that? For cancer researchers, it's a pretty straightforward answer, right? Well, then we can cure people or even prevent them from ever getting cancer. Wouldn't that be great, right? And most people would say, yeah, it's pretty much unequivocally a good thing. Yes, although I remember that Philips did try to convince the Czech government that if they allowed more smoking, they would kill off people at 60 and they wouldn't have a lot of healthcare expenses for the elderly. So not everyone agrees that curing cancer is a good thing, but most of us. So one thing we could do with general purpose AI is actually do what we already know how to do, which is for us, in privileged societies, we can have a decent standard of living. We can do that for everyone on Earth. And that will be about a tenfold increase in GDP. And the net present value, as economists call it, the cash equivalent, about $13.5 quadrillion. So that's sort of a lowball estimate of the value of achieving general purpose AI. Right? The true value is probably much higher, because we can actually then do things that we can't currently do, right? We could do much better healthcare on an individualized basis, far more effective kinds of education that would deliver enormous value to individuals. We could accelerate the rate of science and so on. So the upside is really unbelievably high. That creates a kind of a giant magnet in the future that is pulling us towards it. And the closer we get to it, the more the force of that magnet is pulling us along. And we are seeing now some real advances. We moved out of the lab, onto the roads. We, beat the human world Go champion, something that was predicted to take another 100 years. Back in '97, when we beat when an AI program beat the human world champion at chess, experts said, oh, well, that's fine. Chess is easy. Go is really hard. It'll take another 100 years for that to happen. But slightly less than 20 years. But as we move out of the lab, we also see some of the negative consequences starting to occur. Right? I take it this is a rhetorical question, it's pervasive in all kinds of subtle ways. In the ads that people see, in what happens when they submit their resumes, with automated filtering of resumes, and what kind of resumes get through the filter. In algorithms that are deciding who gets mortgages, who gets credit cards, what size of credit limit do you have on your card, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to become more pervasive as AI systems start to do more and more things in the economy. And one way of thinking about this is that all these algorithms are simply trained with the wrong objective. The objective that we train predictive algorithms with is consistency with the training data, period. And that's just stupid, right? If anyone actually sat down and thought, is this the right objective for our algorithm? They would say, oh, no, of course it's not the right objective. But that's actually what's happened. Now, there are technical solutions in terms of mathematical definitions of fairness, of different definitions that may be appropriate for different applications. And they create real trade-offs because, in fact, you can't have accuracy and fairness both being maximized simultaneously. So, so someone ends up paying, and who's going to pay? These are all policy questions, and we don't have good answers for those. other things that AI is doing, magnifying disinformation, facilitating cybercrime. I saw an estimate from apparently a reputable source. Of course, it might be misinformation, but saying that cybercrime costs the world $6 trillion a year, right? Which is 10 times the amount we spend on software and 10 times the amount we spend on semiconductors. So in that sense, the entire computing industry is a net loss to the human race. So we're obviously doing something wrong there. We are now seeing AI used in weapons to kill people without a human in the loop. So the weapon is finding human targets, deciding which ones to attack, and then killing them. And this is only going to get worse and worse, creating potentially weapons of mass destruction where one person can press a button and launch 10 million weapons and wipe out entire cities, entire ethnic groups, whatever nefarious goal people want to have happen. So there are some bright points on the horizon. One is that the new EU AI law, which is still being debated, has a very concrete ban on the impersonation of human beings. So that when you are interacting with another entity, you have a right to know if it's a human being or not. And this gets to the fundamental question of human dignity, right, which is the basis for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The European Charter on Human Rights is all about human dignity. But if you don't even know if it's a human being, then how can you apply the concept of human dignity to the interaction, the relationship? So here's a quick question, right? Which of these is fake and which is real? They're all fake. Yes, correct. These are all fake, and these will soon be animated. Speaking to you, interacting with you. The metaverse, if you've heard about that, this is Facebook's new business project. To create a vast simulated world in which everyone will spend all their time, is going to be populated, if they have their way, with vast numbers of fake humans who will be your friends. You will never know that they're not human, but they'll gradually be convincing you to buy the latest Gucci watch or whatever it is, and you won't even know that this is happening, right? So there'll be, instead of banner ads, they'll be apparently your friends, right? And this is really not a future that people want. So people talk about the impact on employment. Economists argue this both ways, but I think they're coming around to the idea that yes, if there's if there's, in the extreme case, an exact copy of you who is a little bit more cheerful, a little bit less hungover, quite a bit better at the job, and willing to work for free, that most of us aren't going to be able to outcompete that copy of themselves. And so there will be real impacts on employment. Why they put a Terminator robot in the article, this is something I've been arguing with journalists for years. Please stop putting Terminator robots in every article about AI, but I'm losing that battle. Anyway, but if you take this to its logical conclusion, you get the world of Wall-E, right, where human beings are looked after by machines, where the machines run the civilization. And the consequence, as in fact E.M. Forster noted in his 1909 story, The Machine Stops, which I highly recommend because it predicted the internet, email, video conferencing, MOOCs, computer-induced obesity, email backlogs, you name it. He talked about that in that story. But what happens is we become infantilized. The chain of passing our civilization on, knowledge and skills, to the next generation, which has been essential for more than 2 million years, right? Before the human race began, our predecessors were passing on technological skills to the next generation. So through hundreds of thousands of generations, we've done this at a cost of trillions of person years of teaching and learning. that chain could break when it's no longer necessary for us to do it because our machines can take over the knowledge and the skills and run our civilization for us. So those are just some of the ethical and, I would say, common sense questions that come up with AI. But what I want to talk about for the last few minutes is this one. This is Alan Turing, who's the founder of computer science. And he gave a speech in 1951. He talked about the future of AI. He said, it seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control. And no, he doesn't present any solution, any mitigation. This is just a straightforward prediction. Whether this is an ethical question or just a common sense question, I think of it as more common sense. Like we don't want our nuclear power stations to explode. That's not an ethical dilemma, right? We don't want AI to take over the world and extinguish the human race. That's not an ethical dilemma. It's common sense. But it's the kinds of question I think that the Kavli Center is going to have to help with. So one way I think about this is that, in fact, the reason why making AI better and better makes things worse and worse is that we've actually got the definition of the field wrong, right? The way we think about designing and constructing and deploying AI systems is a mistake. And this is what I said at the beginning, right? Machines whose actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And it's a methodology that's common not just to AI, but all these other disciplines that I've listed, where we specify objectives in some form: cost functions, loss functions, utility functions, reward functions, you name it. We specify them, and then we create optimizing machinery that we then deploy. And of course, this doesn't work, right? We've known that for thousands of years. And King Midas is one example where his specification, his objective, everything I touch should turn to gold, right, was a mistake. Because when that was deployed in the real world, his food and his drink and his family all turned to gold, right? So, and many cultures have the same legend in different forms. And it's an important lesson that we in AI and to some extent in economics and other areas haven't learned properly. If a genie grants you 3 wishes, right, what's the third wish? It's always, please undo the first 2 wishes, right? Because I misspecified the objective. And it's starting to happen in really quite dramatic ways already. Because we deploy technology without thinking through this issue properly beforehand. So when you look at the social media algorithms, which some people blame for the sort of gradual dissolution of democracy in the world, and a lot of the bad stuff that's been happening over the last decade, those algorithms are designed to maximize a specified objective. It could be click-through, the probability that you click on the thing that's recommended, the next YouTube video or whatever it might be, or they maximize engagement or eyeball time. The point here is that that objective is really a proxy for revenue generation, and I think, I don't want to necessarily blame the platforms. I think what they thought originally was that to solve that problem, the algorithms would learn to send people what they want to read or watch, right? As opposed to sending people stuff they're not interested in. And it sounds like a nice alignment of interests here. But in fact, that's not the optimal solution. The optimal solution, as Nico pointed out, right, is to modify people's preferences to be easier to satisfy. And that's exactly what the algorithms are doing, possibly aided and abetted by the marketing department's A/B testing and the sort of industries that spring up to feed the preferences of people who have been modified in this way, right? The algorithms don't care what your political opinions are, or they don't even know you have political opinions or brains or bodies or even existence, right? You are just a sequence of clicks to the algorithm, and they just want to produce a sequence of clicks that in the long run maximizes the total, total revenue. And by making you more predictable, maybe more extreme, like if you express an interest in the environment, they can turn you into an eco-terrorist. If you express an interest in defense, they can turn you into an extreme militarist, et cetera, right? And so if the algorithms were better at understanding human psychology and devising brainwashing sequences that were more effective, the outcome would be far worse, right? So the better the AI, when you have misspecified objectives, the worse the outcome, the more of a mess the algorithms are going to make with the parts of the world that were not specified properly in the objective. So we need a different way of thinking about AI. So get rid of this notion of intelligence and replace it with a notion that we humans want to build machines that are beneficial to we humans, right? Our objectives, and as Nico pointed out, this is not a straightforward notion that, what are our objectives and so on, but at least this is a step in the right direction. Not the objectives that we write down in the objective function, but our actual preferences about what we want the future to be like. And of course, the difficulty is that those preferences are in us. We may not, in fact, we can't write them down. We may not even be aware of them. We haven't thought them through, et cetera, but this is the goal that we would like our AI systems to satisfy. And we can turn it actually into a mathematical problem where, it's a multiplayer game, as economists would call it, where the machine's payoff in this game is whatever the human's payoff is. But this is the really important part. The machine doesn't know what that payoff is, right? So it's operating under uncertainty about its own objective, but its own objective is whatever it is that humans want the future to be. And when you solve those games, and we've solved small instances just to see what happens, and others are just thought experiments, it's clear that the behavior you get from the AI system is completely and qualitatively different from the classical case where you have a fixed known objective. So for example, it makes sense for such a system to ask permission if it's about to do some action that changes parts of the world about whose value it's uncertain, right? So if you have a climate engineering system and it comes up with this amazing solution to get carbon dioxide levels back to pre-industrial, and it turns the oceans into sulfuric acid, and it doesn't know your preferences about the oceans, right? Well, it doesn't just do it, right? There's actual positive incentive for the algorithm to ask you, is this okay, right? I'm going to change the the oceans into sulfuric acid. Is that good or bad, right? Because it wants to avoid, by the fact that the payoffs are supposed to be aligned, right? It wants to avoid doing anything that would make you unhappy. So that's where the incentive to ask permission comes from. And in the extreme case, it will want to be switched off if you want to switch it off. Whereas the classical fixed objective pursuer wants not to be switched off because if it's switched off, it can't achieve the objective you've given it, right? And so we go from, in the classical case, a control failure. In the new case, we actually have an incentive for the machine. It wants to be controlled by humans. And we can show it's actually rational for us to build machines that solve these assistance games correctly. And the better the AI in this case, the outcomes end up being better rather than worse. So there's many questions about how this simple mathematical idea extends out into the real world. The first obvious question is, what about the case where you're making decisions that affect many humans, not just one? How do you combine preferences and so on? This is what moral philosophers have thought about for thousands of years, and economists think about, political theorists think about, and other people. So we will be bugging those people, not for answers, of course. We understand there are no answers, but for help in understanding why these things are so difficult. I think in AI we tend to assume that problems have, that has to be a simple solution for that problem, right? Just scale everything to 0 to 1, or add them all up, or simple answers that turn out not to work. How do we make sure that when we have billions of these machines, they don't interact in unexpected ways? How do we deal with the fact that in this assistance game, the human part of the game isn't playing rationally? So how do you start learning about human preferences from humans who don't even express their own preferences correctly through action, right? They do things they regret, they do things they wish they hadn't done, et cetera, right? So, and then lots of practical work to turn it into real technology that people will want to use. So let me talk a little bit about some of the questions that come up when you're deciding for many humans. First of all, obvious question, what about the preferences of people that are different? And that's fine, right? Facebook already has about 3 billion preference models for the 3 billion people who have been part of Facebook. And so going to 8 billion is fine. So there's no assumption here that we're putting in human values, all right, or whose values, right? We aren't putting in any particular set of values, simply learning to predict how each individual person would like the future to be. But you still have to deal with the question of trade-offs. And some philosophers, I would say, it's about a third between utilitarians, people who think about moral rights, and then people who think about virtues as a way of making these kinds of moral decisions. But certainly there are clear cases where it's quite difficult to figure out, should you protect individual rights or should you make decisions that are best at a group level? How do we deal with the fact that people have preferences about others? Most philosophers argue, you should not help some people hurt others just because they enjoy hurting others. That we should zero out the sadism part of people's preferences. But what about the fact that most of our preferences are relative, right? That we enjoy, winning a Nobel Prize not just because it's $1 million, but because it says we're smarter than other people, right? It's a relative good that we can't give everyone a Nobel Prize because then it would lose that relative value, right? How do you if you're going to add people's preferences up, they have to be on some commensurable scale, right? Well, how do we know where, some of you might actually be zombies with no internal subjective experience at all. And when we have, real intelligent robots, they probably will be zombies in that sense, right? And so their scale of preferences is, 0 to 0, and so they won't weigh into the overall thing. But do we all have the same internal scale? I doubt it. How do we look at aggregation over people with different beliefs? And I'll mention that in a minute. And then, a classical philosophy problem from the 19th century, when you make decisions that affect population size, right, how are you comparing those two outcomes when it isn't even the same set of people who are going to exist? And Thanos, as you know, this dude, right, says, if there were half as many people in the universe, the remainder would be more than twice as happy. And so he thinks he's doing a good thing by offing half the people in the universe, which he does. And then sort of retires very satisfied that he's done a good thing from the point of view of utilitarianism. So Financial Times Review says, Thanos gives utilitarianism a bad name. Right? So we don't want, but the point is, AI systems are going to have Thanos levels of power, and they're going to implement a solution to the population question, whether we like it or not, right? And if we don't figure it out, then whatever they do by default is the solution that they're going to implement. And so we had better figure it out before it's too late. Just mention that when you start thinking about real humans, there are enormously complicated problems about how our underlying preferences, if we have them, which is not even clear because of instability, because of internal conflict, and so on. But to the extent that we have preferences at all, we are very poor at converting them into behavior. But the machine's only evidence for what our preferences might be is our behavior, barring fMRI solutions. And so figuring that out is going to be very difficult. Very interesting questions around things like autonomy, right? In some sense, you could think of autonomy as the freedom to do what isn't in your own best interest. And so when you think through this, the conclusion that I've come to provisionally is that AI systems should not figure out how you're going to behave. Because if they do, they are going to start limiting your autonomy. If you think of it as like a freeway with off-ramps, right? They're going to start closing off the off-ramps to make sure that you stay on the freeway, which may be what you were going to do anyway. But I would like to have the option not to do what I was going to do anyway. That's what I mean by autonomy. And so maybe AI systems have to not only refrain from constraining your behavior, but actually refrain from even predicting your behavior. Nico talked a lot about this issue of plasticity of preferences, so what Nico said. And that's sort of a point, right? In a nutshell, that's why we want the Kavli Center, because these are things we can't solve individually, but maybe we can help not solve, but make progress collectively. Thank you.
All right. Any questions? Feel free to come up to the mic, and we'll do a couple questions.
What about having an AI that sort of adjusts the other AI? So have an AI where their objective is to reduce harm and not allow harm to like the population, to sort of give feedback to the other AI that has an objective function that's different?
That's a great question. And yeah, so if you look at Asimov's laws, his first law is don't allow a human being to come to harm. But in objection to Asimov's law, and in some sense it's the dual of what I'm proposing, that so if you think of harm as the opposite of payoff, and preferences about the future, one problem with Asimov's law is you can't prevent harm, right? If I take you to the airport in a taxi, there's a probability that the bridge will collapse in an earthquake, or a semi will crush me into the central reservation and we'll all die. And so if I want to prevent harm, I have to stay in the garage, right? So we can't live our lives that way. We're actually constantly taking risks, even though mostly the risks are pretty small, and we learn how to make these trade-offs. If you have a system, so you could have a kind of a censoring system, right? And this is actually something we do in computer science called program checking, where we don't trust that the first program we wrote actually works properly, so we have another program that's constantly watching its output to make sure that it complies with the specifications. And it's a perfectly feasible way of constructing. But what it ends up looking like actually is that composite system is actually implementing an objective function that is either, it's still going to end up looking like a single objective function. So the uncertainty about human objectives is really core, and we have to, that's the thing that gives us control, right?
Hi, thank you for this inspiring talk. I have a more practical question around algorithms and AI. Often they're already making decisions now that are pretty consequential for people if they get out on bail, child welfare, things like that. And at the same time, we're not even allowed to understand what the algorithm actually is doing. And that's also true for a lot of social media companies that use algorithms, but the users can't know how the algorithms actually function. And so how would you address that problem? Because that seems to be, to me, as a major battle, because of companies claiming it's proprietary and it's part of their competitive advantage to keep the algorithm secret. But at the same time, you constantly manipulate it and you lose autonomy and agency. So how do we balance this, and how can we win this battle?
A great question. I actually think, for consequential decisions, there has to be transparency. And in credit decisions, for example, this has been in the law for nearly 50 years. And that's why for, credit card loans, extending credit limits and so on, you can't use neural nets. So they use decision trees and logistic regression functions, which are simple enough that you can actually decompose the features and understand the decision, and then you can see, well, I need to fix this in order to get the loan. I would argue that this is actually going to be essential. So that the example of asking permission, right? It won't make sense for the AI system to ask permission if you have no understanding of the plan it's proposing, right? The example I gave with the oceans is pretty simple, but it could say, well, look, here's this plan, and you look at this like, what on earth is that? I don't understand what it's for, what it does. It has to be able to explain it to you for that process to work. So it'll be in the interest of AI systems to have the ability to explain their own reasoning. And I've been arguing actually that we probably, even if deep learning does end up working, which I think it won't, but even if it does, we shouldn't necessarily go that way. We could develop alternative technological approaches that do have interpretability. And I think this is something that legislation has to actually address. But thank you. It's a great question.
All right, let's